And I want to explore the different views on those issues, who we are, what America is, and ultimately how those pieces fit together. I want to do that by talking a little bit about religious liberty advocacy. Why do I want to talk about that? Ultimately, religious liberty, which comes in two constitutional forms, touches on questions core to our rights and responsibilities as religious citizens in the United States. What are, when I say the constitutional aspects of these kinds of cases? So on the one hand, we have a free exercise clause enshrined in the First Amendment, which says that all American citizens have a right to the free exercise of religion, which is typically understood as words implicating or instructing courts and government that all citizens have a right to religious liberty. That's one. Two, we have an establishment clause. The establishment clause prohibits government from establishing a religion, which is typically taken as capturing a principle of separation of church and state. And both of those principles speak to a citizen's relationship, in particular, sometimes a religious citizen's relationship to the United States. What kind of liberty do I have for my religion? What is the proper relationship for religion and the public square? Now, when you think about these two pieces, what we think the scope and contours of each principle ought to be, ultimately it comes down to, I would propose to submit to you, to some extent, who you think you are in terms of being a religious citizen and what your expectations are as a result of the United States. And so what I want to do ultimately is talk about how we as American Jews, or really through our Jewish institutions, have advocated around cases implicating these principles. We're going to look over the next 2 days at hopefully 6 cases, maybe more, maybe less, 6 cases where American Jewish institutions have been thrust into the role of advocate, trying to explore or explain, cajole sometimes, the Supreme Court and telling it what it thinks the right answer is to particular religious liberty dilemmas. And by looking at those religious liberty dilemmas, how different institutions have advocated around those cases, I want to show you different visions of how American Jews have understood themselves and have understood the American project. Okay, when I say that we're going to look at advocacy, so what I've selected for you, hopefully you can see the source sheet. For those of you who've joined late, maybe Tali, if you could post it one more time. I know you don't see it if you join a little bit late. What we have in these source sheets are excerpts from, primarily, I'll say something on Wednesday about a different kind of source, but primarily we're going to be looking at excerpts from amicus briefs. What amicus briefs are, they're third-party briefs submitted to a court, friend of the court brief, where a third party says, listen, I know A and B are having this fight and you're about to resolve it, but I need you to know that I've got some interests that are also implicated in this case. And I want to tell you about my interests and tell you what what you ought to learn from those interests, from those concerns, and take that into account when you're trying to figure out how to resolve the particular issue between A and B. We're not going to be looking at any old amicus briefs. We're going to be looking at amicus briefs submitted by Jewish institutions before the Supreme Court of the United States. And in each instance, in each case, what I'm going to show you is 2 very different approaches for how Jewish institutions advocated in a particular case and how they advocated as Jews. And each institution as Jews came to very different conclusions about what Jewish identity, Jewish values, and Jewish interests told the Supreme Court about how it ought to decide a case. So that's kind of the big idea that I want to try to get at over the course of the next 2 days. For each case, I'm going to follow a pretty kind of regular blueprint. I'm going to introduce you to a case, tell you a story, so to speak, explain the stakes of the case. What I'd like to do at that point is ask you all who you think should win the case and why. So I'll throw the question out there, and I hope you'll raise your hand using the raise hand function. You'll tell me what you think about why side A should win, and why they should win, why side B should win, and why they should win. And then we'll ask a second question. The second question will be not who should win the case and why, but we'll look at the 2 excerpts, and I'll ask you who did a better job advocating as a Jewish institution and why. Now, you'll probably want to say to me, what do you mean by a better job? Oh, I'm not going to answer the question. We all have instincts about what it means to be to do a better job. And I want you to consider who you think of these institutions representing Jews before the highest court in the United States, who did a better job and why. And then I want to tease out the way in which each of the excerpts touches on our core question, meaning touches on our question as to how they viewed who American Jews were and how they fit into the broader American project. Okay, that's the game plan for the next 2 days. By the way, if that's not what you signed up for, it's not too late. In the bottom right corner, there's a leave button. Run for the hills. But if this is your bag, I look forward to learning with you over today and then again on Wednesday. Okay, so hopefully all of you see the source sheet and you can click on the source sheet, which is in the chat. And I'm going to start by introducing our first case, a pretty well-known case for a variety of reasons, a case called Bob Jones University v. United States. I wonder, I see not too many of you have your videos on. Oh, I see some people familiar from the summer. Oh dear, some of you from the summer who have come back. I see iPad 5 is back and Joan is back. It's nice to see some familiar faces from the summer. For those of you who are back, I hope you enjoy. There will be some overlap, some new stuff. Thankfully, there's more religious liberty litigation for us to discuss together. So let's start with, in many ways, my favorite way of exploring this subject, a case from 1983, Bob Jones University of the United States. Anybody here, you can feel free to raise your hand. Have you heard of this case before? Do the words, oh, I see Sandy also. Do the words, okay, good. I see some hands up. I see some people raising their hands. Let me tell you a story from 1983. 1983, there was this evangelical university, South Carolina, called Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University had this extraordinary policy. Here was the policy. The policy used to be that they wouldn't take any African Americans as students at the university. Then they changed the policy, and they changed the policy to they would accept students of all races, but they wouldn't allow for interracial dating. Okay, why not? Why no interracial dating? Well, I'll tell you. The reason why no interracial dating was because if you had interracial couples, the concern was that ultimately the entire world would turn into one race. Now, why would that be a problem? In this view, in this biblical reading, or I'd say New Testament reading employed by Bob Jones University, if we all become one race, it's going to trigger Armageddon. And in their view, Armageddon was a bad thing. And so we couldn't have interracial dating at Bob Jones University because we'd be one race. And if we were one race, it would trigger Armageddon, and they're against Armageddon. Okay. The IRS got wind of this policy, and they came to the following conclusion. You know, Bob Jones University, like many universities, is a tax-exempt 501c3. Every time somebody donates dollars to them, those dollars are tax deductible. And you know, the government's giving up revenue every single time it allows an institution to be a tax-exempt 501c3. And ultimately, the IRS thought, listen, to be a charity, to be a nonprofit, to be exempt in this way from donations being taxable, you had to be in the public interest. And as a result, IRS made the following argument. You know, given your policy against interracial dating, we don't think you're in the public interest. And because we don't think you're in the public interest, we don't think you should be a tax-exempt 501c3, so we're pulling your tax-exempt status. Bob Jones University was obviously unhappy with this decision. One can imagine what the consequences were for Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University, if all donations to Bob Jones University ceased to be tax-exempt, in all likelihood, the institution would at some point have to stop operating. Let's think about why. I mean, for every donor who's thinking of giving $100 to Bob Jones University, I mean, they'll think about giving it to some other university or some other religious entity that is tax exempt, because why not get the tax exemption? And so you can imagine the millions and millions of dollars Bob Jones University thought it would be losing because of this IRS decision. And so Bob Jones University filed suit, a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they said the following. They said, your decision, IRS, regarding our tax exempt status violates our religious liberty. And the reason why it violates our religious liberty is because we have taken this view about interracial dating. It is predicated on our deeply held theology. And you're telling us that because of our theological views, our theological commitments, we are going to lose a government benefit. And that choice is unfair. It's not only unfair, they said it was unconstitutional. That is not the free exercise of religion. It's exercise of religion with a massive cost. That's not free. And so Bob Jones University said, the policy of the IRS violates the First Amendment of the Constitution. Okay, for all of those I can see, everybody with me so far in the stakes of the case? Okay. Anybody have a view on who should win? For those of you who have heard some of this from me over the summer, no cheating. Anybody with a thought on who should win? Oh, don't be shy. Who's going to be the first person who jumps in, clicks on the raise hand function, and gives me a view? Who should win, Bob Jones or the IRS? It's going to be a while. Somebody can do it. I know some of you and you're talkers, and you have views, good views.
Joan Borkow has an answer.
Joan, I don't quite see you yet on the screen, but what do you think?
Just an uneducated thought about the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, that by basing their plea on a religious clause, they were asking the government to establish a religion because they were basing it on biblical theology.
So, there's one, Joan expresses a view. This is actually a matter of constitutional litigation in the early 70s. Maybe we're thinking about this case all wrong. Maybe the way to think about this case is, Joan says, and in fact, some litigants have said, every time the United States gives a tax exemption to a religious institution, and in that way subsidizes the religious institution's theological views, we have a problem separation of church and state. And maybe if we have a problem of separation of church and state, it should be unconstitutional in the exact opposite way. Bob Jones thought. Bob Jones thinks there's a constitutional problem. Sure, there's a constitutional problem. We never should have given you tax exempt status. Okay, that's how Joan views this through the prism of the Establishment Clause and thinks that maybe Bob Jones University should never have had tax exempt status. In fact, many religious institutions as a result shouldn't have tax exempt status. Who else? Anybody else with a thought? Anybody here think Bob Jones should win? Let's see. I see Eva just raised her hand physically. That works for me. Okay, Eva, I'm going to unmute you. I just did it, Eva. Go ahead.
I guess it's a general question about private versus public education. In general, if a school is private, is it entitled to its religious foundation and belief system if it's private?
Yeah, so as a general matter, we have lots of religious institutions that function on the basis of religious principles and tenets. Think of your favorite house of worship. Tons of institutions surely do so. And, the question then is, of course, to what extent should we allow those kinds of private institutions to benefit from the state? That's one question. And in turn, what constitutes benefiting from the state? Or maybe differently, what's exempting that, what's just treating them fairly like every other institution? Okay, good. I see I'm getting more people coming in. I see Wayne has his hand up, and then Miriam, I see you have a question in the chat. Wayne, let's see if we can find you. Go ahead. Okay, Wayne,
Wayne, I'm sorry, it's not letting me unmute you. Give me one more second.
Wayne, we're going to put you on hold for a minute. Come back.
Actually, you could try unmuting. For some reason, it's not letting me.
It didn't work for me either.
Oh,
okay.
He's unmuted.
Oh,
okay. So
Wayne, hit me.
I guess my concern is with the language that you said to be in the public interest.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like, does this involve then courts getting entangled in all sorts of a whole wide range of issues that are going to be difficult to make determinations on based on this in the public interest criteria?
The answer is yes, with 100% certainty. That's what it does. And I will tell you, the IRS, to my knowledge, has only done this 7 times, always in interests of racial discrimination. This did come up again. Bob Jones University, the holding of the court, we'll learn about soon. Ultimately, the court sides with the IRS. This came up again in the same-sex marriage litigation in 2015. Justice Alito actually asked the Solicitor General during oral argument. He said, listen, if we grant same-sex marriage, an institution takes a Bob Jones University-like view regarding same-sex marriage, will we subject them to the same rule? Will we say, you also lose your tax-exempt status? And the Solicitor General during oral argument said he's not sure, but there are going to be issues. In the same way that Wayne just described, once we have the government saying this is or is not in the public interest, there's no particular or clear set of rules that tell the IRS when to trigger that and when to not trigger that. At the same time, you can imagine governments having a strong reason to want to exercise judgment in this area, to not put its imprimatur on instances of certain kinds of discrimination that it finds wholly objectionable, and thereby grant some degree of, they're ultimately subsidizing in some way this sort of behavior. I see Rabbi Joyce Newmark.
Yep.
Rabbi Joyce.
I'm going to argue for Bob Jones.
Okay.
It brings me back to many years ago. I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we were trying to create a county human rights organization among all the clergy. And it became very clear that pretty much you could find a way that every religion discriminates in ways that violate American law. That you could go after the Catholics because they didn't allow female priests. You could go at all kinds of things like that. For me, as a conservative rabbi, I would not marry a Jew and a non-Jew. I would not consider people who consider themselves Jews to be legally Jewish. And it gets very messy. And since what underlies the tax exemption, I believe, for religious institutions is that the overarching belief that religion is a good thing for the country. Again, you can't, when you start dragging the courts into individuals, churches, theology or practice or halakha, you've got a mess.
Okay, good. So Rabbi Newmark says, listen, we have an issue here. I get it. Maybe in this case, I find some of this conduct objectionable, but what's the next case over? And it kind of very Wayne-like in a certain way. How do we figure out what are the instances in which we are willing to trigger this kind of, well, you're not in the public interest? Now, is there a difference arguing for race versus religion, Eva asks. I mean, that is certainly the question. One can easily, Miriam still has a question. Miriam, you're up next, I promise. As Eva says, like interracial dating, we prohibit. Okay, I can kind of see that maybe. Different views on that here. Interfaith dating, maybe I should say if we had a religious university that prohibited interfaith dating, what would we say? Would we say, no, you're discriminating against people based on their faith, and as a result, we'll pull your tax exempt status? How do we want to think about the government's authority to engage in this kind of restriction, given the background First Amendment? On the flip side, how do we think about the government actually subsidizing institutions that engage in these sorts of behavior? Okay, Miriam, you've been super patient.
A little nervous here. So I was thinking about sort of the conflict between different rights. The right, I'm not sure if interfaith dating or interracial dating is it constitutionally protected under free assembly or freedom of association? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer or anything like that. So I'm wondering if one right is pitted up against another right. So that's one question I had. And the other question I had was, you know, I mean, there are various practices within different religions that one might say we can tolerate this, and other practices that we would consider abhorrent. If a Muslim sect decides that it's their freedom of religion to stone an adulterous woman or cut off someone who commits theft, cut off their hand, and they say, well, that's all right under our religious interpretation, we would consider it pretty abhorrent for a government to allow that. So there must be a line that's drawn where we say, this seems okay, and this seems that this is really a violation against our values. It also brings to mind President Trump's recent, I'm not sure if it passed in law, where he said that he's not going to provide tax exemption to colleges and universities that fail to protect Jews from anti-Semitic attacks. And that also stirred up a whole controversy. So anyway, I just threw out a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, so let's think about that. And some of it dovetails with the question that Amy Klein just put in the chat. You know, what are the underlying kind of constitutional rules in these kinds of contexts? So as a general matter, private institutions, the amendments, the Constitution, it speaks to government. Only government can violate the Constitution. Private institutions can't. So, you know, that's why the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's only Congress, and then via the 14th Amendment, government generally, that can violate the Constitution. Private actors can't. It just doesn't speak to them. Now, we have various legislation, most famously the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that prohibits certain kinds of discrimination in different areas: employment discrimination, businesses from discriminating, educational institutions discriminating on the basis of sex, a variety of areas in which institutions aren't allowed to, because of legislation, aren't allowed to discriminate. So the question is, checking in on the chat. The question is, of course, you know, are there underlying issues over here with respect to, well, what are the lurking kind of legal arguments that might be deployed? And if you think about it that way, so, you know, certainly the individuals or the prospective students that say we would like to be able to come to this institution, they might be able to make arguments depending on the kind of discrimination under various forms of federal legislation. For Title IX under the Civil Rights Act comes to mind, which prohibits educational institutions from engaging in sex-based discrimination. The issue over here is Title IX and a variety of other forms of federal legislation regarding discrimination have opt-outs for religion. And they say, well, this is true unless you're a religious institution, which ultimately is going to kind of funnel us all back into the same kind of question, which is, you know, to what extent do we want as a society to say there's a religious exemption from these forms of discrimination, given kind of the competing interests at stake in these cases? So that's the big issue. And then there's just the secondary piece of this case, which is, of course, this is the IRS getting involved. You know, these students maybe could file a variety of suits, but the question is, you know, is this for the IRS to be taking on? Maybe it's not for the IRS to be taken on. Maybe the IRS should do what it does, and these students should be the ones to file suit if they have ultimately an issue. Okay, I see I have a couple more questions. I know Joan Sachs, one of my favorite Hartman students of all time, has a question. So Joan, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. And I've enjoyed all your classes, so I'm back.
Have you left me a Yelp review yet?
I'd be happy to. Would you like
I don't
one?
have a Yelp page. Okay, I'm just messing
Okay,
with you. Go ahead, Joan.
let's check it. Okay. So here's my question. I know that women can now enter Harvard and Columbia and a variety of other schools, but there is no ERA amendment. So in the case of Bob Jones, and yes, it involves the IRS, I realize that, if women had wanted to enter Bob Jones, would they be denied if they could not enter Bob Jones previously? Or would the IRS say, make a choice? If you want to remain a nonprofit, you have to allow women to enter.
So Title IX of the Civil Rights Act prohibits sex-based discrimination. So in theory, if your average university tried to do that, the answer would be no. But there's a religious exemption to Title IX. So a
That's what I
religious
thought.
institution
Yeah.
is allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex. Now, there's some debate over here. I don't know how many people are interested in I never know who's on the call. But for those of you on the call wondering about this, there is a debate among federal courts whether or not a institution of higher education or an educational institution needs to get a waiver, a religious exemption from the government before engaging in this form of conduct. This was a big issue under the Obama administration, which actually started publishing a list of all the institutions that requested religious exemptions to Title IX. I think, there are different kinds of views of this. I think some people viewed that as a form of public shaming, and some people viewed it as a way, first of all, to make sure we had an orderly granting of these sorts of exemptions. And in addition, for institutions to have the courage of their conviction and not to kind of hide discrimination, but to show it on the front end so that people knew which institutions were engaging in this sort of conduct. I see I do have a couple more hands, but I do want to, iPad 5, is that Harriet? Do I remember that correctly? iPad 5 will remind me if I have her name correctly. So there are exemptions under Title IX for all male and all female institutions. And there are some details there, which I think we probably won't get into. Okay, good. So hopefully you have felt kind of the stakes of the case as a general matter. What I want to think about now is not kind of and this is listen, this case, people talk about forever. It is a case that keeps on coming back, that seems to be a massive clash of values. I want to think about this now, and I'm going to put up on my screen kind of the two excerpts from the source sheet. I want to think about this not just as how should America deal with this, but how should American Jews think about it? Okay, and so hopefully now you are seeing, if you're not, that stinks. Hopefully you're seeing the two excerpts from Bob Jones University. If somebody wants to give me a physical thumbs up to let me know that actually happened, that'd be great. Okay, good. Everyone's thumbs are working extremely well. So here what I have for you are two excerpts from two amicus briefs. Now, let's keep in mind, a brief is long. It's like 30, 40, 50 pages, right? I've given you a paragraph. So I'm certainly being unfair to the entirety of the argument that was advanced by these various Jewish institutions when it came to Bob Jones. But I've tried to find representative paragraphs that capture the core of what these two briefs argued. And so hopefully, if you'll indulge me, I want to give each of these paragraphs a quick read. Okay, so take a look at the first one, the brief of the National Jewish Commission on Law and Public Affairs, often referred to as COLPA. And it's a very famous brief, cited in very famously by Robert Cover in an article that I think Jews often talk about. Nomos, a narrative, this article that a translation of Halacha and Agadah, his attempt to kind of wrestle with the life of religious communities and how that should in principle work in the United States. And not surprisingly, he cites this brief, and this is kind of, I think, one of the core paragraphs. So here's this attempt of COLPA to try and talk about why it thinks Bob Jones University should win. Here's what they say. The purpose of the First Amendment is to protect minorities from the tyranny of the majority. The government represents and acts for the majority, of course, because it's democratic, but the majority may not use its power to control the government to destroy the constitutional rights of the minority, whether through taxation or otherwise. We get it, majority's in charge, but government shouldn't use the authority of the majority to destroy the constitutional rights of the minority. Tax exemption is a status without which most nonprofit organizations could not exist in today's world. The purpose of the First Amendment and its limitation on the powers of the majority would be frustrated if tax exemption and, with it, economic viability could be granted to or withheld from the minority by the majority merely because the minority, in pursuit of its religious rights, refuses to conform to the social practices of the majority. That's quite a sentence, long sentence, lots of majorities and minorities, but hopefully the thrust of it comes through. If the majority could so behave, the First Amendment would be meaningless. Okay, that's argument number one. I want you to hold it there for a second. I want to take a look at the second one, and I want to talk a little bit about a comparison between the two. This is from the American Jewish Committee, and they filed a brief in favor of the IRS, in favor of the United States. And here's kind of their explanation. At least this was from a paragraph in their explanation of why they have an interest in this case. The American Jewish Committee is a 50,000 member national organization which was founded in 1906 for the purpose of protecting the civil and religious rights of Jews. It has always been AJC's conviction that the security and constitutional rights of American Jews can best be protected by helping to preserve the security and constitutional rights, including specifically the right to equal educational opportunities of all Americans, irrespective of race, creed, or national origin. Therefore, AJC has participated in numerous cases before this court involving racial discrimination by educational institutions. It is AJC's position that the denial of tax-exempt status to educational institutions which are racially discriminatory as a matter of religious conviction does not violate the First Amendment's free exercise clause. Okay, here we have dueling views from Jewish institutions as to how this case should come out. And here, let's start off with an easy question. Well, who do you think did a better job? Oh, don't be shy. David Yaffe raised his hand. David Yaffe is in. David? Oh, and Clara Silver said AJC.
One moment, David. Oh, you're unmuted.
Can we get David in?
Yep.
You hear me? Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah, David, hit us. Oh, where'd David go?
In a narrow sense, the case was about whether a tax exemption should be granted, whether the federal government should subsidize this institution that decides to discriminate racially. And the Supreme Court, and particularly now going forward, is going to decide cases on narrow grounds. So I think the American Jewish Committee addressed the specific question better. It didn't say step in and stop Bob Jones from discriminating. It said we should, that they shouldn't be federally subsidized through the tax exemption. In doing so, end of story.
Okay, okay, good. Okay, good, good. I see we've got a couple more. Susie, I see you said National Jewish Commission. Can I ask you why you think that? Well, let's see if we can find Susie. I'm scrolling down. Susie, I found you and I'm unmuting you. Oh, there you go. Susie, why do you think culpa?
I'm going to start my video too.
Oh, hi, Susie.
Hi. Okay. I think the idea of the majority and the minority and who should be able to decide that we have to protect the rights of the minority, that's what the First Amendment's about.
Okay, good. So kind of from your perspective, read these two and you see a very powerful paragraph from culpa expressing concern about the long-term prospects of minorities. If kind of, again, Wayne was the first one to mention this concern. How do we constrain this idea that if you're not in the public interest, all of a sudden, you lose tax exempt status? That feels unwieldy. Susie, I want to ask you a follow-up question though, if we can unmute Susie one more time. I'm going to do it. Here we go. Do you think that AJC also views this case as a question of protecting minorities?
I'm just looking at it again real quick.
Sure.
Well, sure. All Americans, irrespective of race, creed, or national origin.
So I'm with you, by the way. When I read these paragraphs, Susie, I say to myself, the first one has this powerful thrust, it says the word a lot, of protecting minorities. But the AJC also wants to protect minorities. So given that they start from the same place or a similar place, how do they end up at opposite conclusions? Is that a fair question? I see Joan wants in, but Joan's heard me say this before, so she's cheating. I can't do it. I'm not going to have, no, okay. Let's see what we've got over here. I see we have Susie. Feel free to kind of think about that. Why can't there be intermediate tax status, something in between complete tax exemption and full tax burden? There could be, Rabbi Sapowith, but it's not what the IRS wanted. Meaning, as I think we've learned more and more recently, you know, the Supreme Court can't say, listen, we'd like to split the baby and we're going to create a new piece of legislation that we think does a better job. They get to determine whether or not the actual issues before it, in the here and now, whether or not those are constitutional or not constitutional. Rabbi Sachs says there are competing values in the Constitution, no doubt. I see a bunch of AJCs and a bunch of iPad 5 wants. My friends are want in. I'm going to try and give those of you who've heard some of this before, I'm going to push you to the back of the line. Don't kill me. I still love you. But I do see Randy Lampert trying to get in. Oh, can we unmute Randy?
There. I think the difference in the two is how you define being a minority.
Okay, good.
So is the minority based on you're actually a minority, like the AJC says, something you can't change, a racial minority, or a minority in the first one? They're saying that a Christian university, which in my mind is definitely in the majority as a religion in our country, is a minority just based on this decision that they have of wanting to discriminate. And therefore, because they have a different way of behaving than the majority, that inherently makes them a minority religion or a minority group. And that's why I would side with the AJC, because I don't think a Christian university should be able to call themselves a minority group.
Okay, interesting. Randy, let me ask you the following question, but let's think about the authors of the Culpa brief. You know, from their perspective, they're expressing a concern about all minority religions, and certainly they're a Jewish institution thinking about Jewish rights. How does that impact kind of your thinking about it? You know,
well, I think
go ahead.
That Judaism by definition is a minority religion. We are what, less than 1% of Americans. So regardless of what our policies are, we are a minority religion. I don't think that means we should be able to do whatever we want policy wise either. Like they were saying, like Muslims shouldn't be able to cut off people's hands, but you could at least classify them as a minority religion and consider it from that perspective. Okay. I don't think that a population that is in the majority in the country should be able to find themselves as a minority just based on what they want to do.
Okay, so
we are a minority because we want to discriminate, and the rest of the country thinks that's bad. So therefore we are a minority and we want to claim minority status.
Okay, good. I'm going to come back to something you just said in a second, but I see a couple more hands. Alan, can we get Alan Halpern in? Let's see if that'll work. Alan, I unmuted you, I hope.
I think you did.
Oh, awesome.
This has been touched on since I posted the comment that there are multiple minorities here. And the question becomes which minority's interest prevails. So the conservative, if I parse the Christian community, then conservative Christians may in fact be a minority. And does society have a greater interest in racial integration and equality than it does in protecting the speech of that particular minority? And that seems to be the essential question. So somebody mentioned the possibility of, if we have a sect that's decided that it's appropriate to stone an adulteress, is that murder or is that religious law? And is it in the interest of society to protect the interest of the individual who may be stoned above the faith tradition of which that individual is presumably a part? And so in addition to the minorities, you have the individuals who may be involved. Okay,
good. Okay, so Alan has put a couple of things on the table. Obviously, there's the general issue of the communities versus the individuals. And there's also this question of communities or minorities, which seems to be one of the thornier questions going on over here. Carrie in the chat notes, but Christianity is not a monolithic, oh, it just moved religion. There are Christianities. And as a result, because there are multiple forms of Christianity, how do you want to think about the different kinds of minorities that are, that have their interests aren't aligned in this case. And when you think about it in that way, one of the core questions you have to ask if you're a Jewish institution that both briefs are implicitly asking is, what kind of religious minority does the American Jewish community most readily see its kind of future intertwined with? I don't want to say quite as a definitional matter, but you can see the way in which Kolpa's brief ultimately thinks of Jews as first and foremost a religious minority. And because it sees Jews first and foremost as a religious minority, the way in which its concerns play out are, well, what will this mean? You have this small sect of evangelical Christians who have taken a view that very few people adhere to. I'm not familiar with any other Christian colleges or universities that take this view. Very small sect of Christianity that takes this view. Kolpa says one day that could be us. On the flip side, AJC says, we have people because of their, let's call it affiliation, because of the community they identify with, whether it's race, as they say, race, creed, national origin, being denied an opportunity in higher education. And so AJC says, I'll tell you who I, as a Jew, feel most like. I know that story, the AJC says. Oh, it's lurking in the background, certainly, of the brief. I know the story of Jews being denied opportunities in higher education. I see our community as most like those minorities. Both briefs are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to figure out who we are as American Jews, who as an American minority we most look like, our concerns are most aligned with, our future is most intertwined with. The debate is ultimately, what I touched on at the outset, is how do we view ourselves as a Jewish community first and foremost. And it's only in answering that sort of question can you begin to decide how you want to approach this sort of case. Saying you're for minority rights isn't enough to answer the question. What you really need to figure out is what kind of minority are you like? And you predicate that based upon your long-term values and your long-term interests. I see there's a whole bunch of stuff in the chat, which forgive me, I've definitely missed a bunch of it. Let me see if I can catch up. The problem is that when we approach a case on a narrow basis, we can damage ourselves for future cases. No question about that, Joe. No question. Certainly, same-sex marriage litigation has raised these questions again. And I suspect, not for the last time, Alan says, the instruments of racism, discrimination, lending practices, hiring practices are not imposed by government, although they may or may not be sanctioned by governments. That's certainly true, Alan, that private institutions, as I mentioned at the outset, have the ability to engage in various forms of discrimination. The question is, when we start regulating discrimination, do we say that religious institutions, have the ability to still live out their lives in a manner that's consistent with their values and rules and interests, notwithstanding a push on the other side that we need to protect some other minority from various forms of discrimination? I see. Oh, we've got multiple Allens now, so this is going to be slightly confusing. In Judaism itself, there's a category deferring government. Yeah, that's true. Let's see. Engaging in acts of bigotry against bigotry and discrimination against oppressed minorities is not engaging in religious activity, Judith says. Sure, you might certainly be of the view that anytime you engage in something that's discriminatory, that is when, based on some sort of criteria, you exclude people from various forms of benefits, it's not religious activity. Although you begin to start wondering, like when we say to the Catholic Church, listen, we get that all your priests are men, but now you need to have some women. Do they not think they're engaging in religious activity when they only select male priests? This was an issue that came before the court relatively recently, 2012, and again in 2020. Certainly religious communities think certain kinds of choices that they make that look discriminatory from the outside are ultimately based on their theology, and they can't differentiate that between that and, you know, a desire to have kosher food. I see somebody put a comment in with my first name first, which means I feel like very serious. When my wife says Michael or Avi, I know that could you address the possibility that society might find, no, that's great, Carrie, I love it, might find it in the interest of society not to allow babies' foreskins to be cut off. In this talk, I'm not going to, in our two, well, let me see if I can say something about that. It's certainly true. I mean, there was an attempt in San Francisco to prohibit circumcision back in 2011, so it's certainly possible. And one would need a religious liberty exemption if there were such legislation in order to get an exemption. But that's for another time, I would say. I would say ultimately, yeah, you would need religious liberty exemptions from those sorts of things. How those cases might come out, I'd like to, well, is a complicated question. Okay. I'm going to try to read one last question. Alan again. As someone raised earlier, how different is the conclusion of Jones regarding Armageddon from the decision of the rabbinate not to officiate at marriages between Jews and non-Jews? If the IRS stripped synagogues, seminaries, or rabbinical associations of their tax exemption because they discriminate against non-Jews, you know, often when I do this case with high school students, I'll often ask them their opinion in three cases. The Bob Jones case. Then I'll try to switch it and I'll say, imagine it's not Bob Jones University, but it's a Jewish university and they prohibit interfaith dating. And then a Jewish university that prohibits same-sex dating. And I'll ask them what their views are in those three cases. And, you know, people bounce around pretty good in those three cases as to what they think the outcome should be. And it's not, you know, you end up building a theory out of your views on those three cases. You know, what is it that you really think? And my hope is, at least through this sort of case, through Bob Jones University, what I've convinced you at a minimum is that saying you're for minority rights isn't enough. You have to think deeply about who you think, what kind of community you are as an American Jew before you can approach this sort of question that pits these two kinds of minority communities in many ways, for lack of a better way of saying it, against each other. And that's kind of the first half of what I wanted to think about, this kind of, you know, Jews in the American and the American project through religious liberty, how our views, how our advocacy on religious liberty ultimately helps surface how we fit into the American project. Okay. I see I just got a private message about Scientology. That's going to be complicated stuff. I have a lot to say about Scientology, religious arbitration agreements. You can Google for those, but for now, I'm going to kick that one down the road. Okay. That's case number one. I see it's 11:49. Okay, let's grab another case. Let's see if we can jump on to case number two. We all good with case number two? I see there's still some hands and there's still some chat going on, but I'd love to cover at least two cases today, if not three. Okay, I want to go back in time. 1961. We're going backwards. And in going backwards, I want to talk about Sunday closing laws. Anybody here remember Sunday closing laws? Sure. Now, in one of the great ironies of all of history, I feel like, it's not such a big deal, but, you know, the only, as far as I'm aware, the only county in the entire United States that still has a full-on Sunday closing law, soup to nuts, so to speak, is Bergen County, which I think is largely populated by Jews. Okay, good. I find that hilarious. Let's leave that aside. So I want to think a little bit about Sunday closing laws. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, as kind of you had the beginnings of America, you know, pulling away from certain, I would say, religious underpinnings or religious givens, maybe kind of moving into its identity as an increasingly religiously diverse society. You had debates over Sunday closing laws, which at the time existed in almost all jurisdictions. The idea was, to some extent or another, shops would be closed on Sunday. And, you know, sometimes they'd open at noon, sometimes they'd open at the end of the day, but you had stores were closed on Sunday. Okay. This went up before the Supreme Court, actually, on a number of instances. And Orthodox Jewish advocates in particular pressed their claims in 1961, arguing that the idea that you had Sunday closing laws violated the First Amendment. Now, I don't want to say what the nature of their arguments were. I want to show you two versions of the argument. And I want you to take time to give them both a quick read. I'm going to give you like 3 minutes to read them to yourselves. 4 minutes. Tali, am I allowed to do that? Is that a thing that we do over here? 4 minutes to read them to yourselves. And then I want to chat about them. Does that work for everybody? Everyone have the source sheets? I may drop it into the chat one more time, just in case somebody does not have the source sheets. Oh, Tali dropped them in the chat. Tali reads my mind. Okay, good. Pop them open. What I want you to take a look at are, now I'll even pull it up on my screen just so you can see them. I want you to take a look at, hopefully you're seeing these over here. Are you seeing Brownfeld v. Brown? Is that what's happening for people? I hope so. Give them both a read, relatively short. And when we come back, I'm going to ask you what the difference is between the two of them. What's the difference? So many words. They're saying the same thing, different things. Okay, I'm going to be quiet for a minute. Can I scroll up, please? Yes, scroll up. Oh, this is very confusing. Scrolling up versus scrolling down. Soon. Judith, is this working for you? Hope so. Two participants raised hands. Okay. Let's see who we got. Okay, I'm going to let Betty Ann Ross, because I missed her and she had a question for a while last time. So Betty's going first. Let's see if we can, I have unmuted Betty, I hope. Nope, I haven't. Oh, amazing. There we go.
Okay. I just wonder how you balance the nature of national identity with the diversity of identities that exist within the nation, because a lot of these laws, I think, probably start from the perspective that an American should blah, blah, blah. Right. And that's a very unifying idea. And I think that's an idea that held sway for a very long time in this country. And it worked for some people and it didn't work for other people. And my suggestion is that there's never going to be something that works for everybody, because you can't possibly say one is 100% good and the other is 100% bad.
I think so. First of all, Betty, that 100% agree with you on that. And ultimately, the way in which we think about drawing the lines in these cases as Jews is what I want to think about here. So given our values and interests and identity, and given what you said, which is 100% right, that this country in many ways, the Supreme Court in the 19th century, says we're a Christian nation. And how do we therefore, as a Jewish community, advocate in these cases as a community with different values, interests, and identity? And I've already suggested that part of that is going to be based on how we see ourselves as a community. And what you're pointing out, which I think is the second half of the dyad, which is, what do we think America ought to be? It came from a particular place. It's going somewhere else. And what are our expectations? So a couple of folks have kind of touched on that point by trying to explain or express the differences between these two briefs. Alan says, the first brief argues an economic imposition, the second, a religious imposition. I think that's really, really sharp. I think that's probably right. We'll say more about that. But I see Miriam has a hand raised. Miriam Pearl, I'm going to try and unmute you. Let's see, did I do that right or not at all? Okay.
Yes, to mirror what you just said, or what was it, David,
that was Alan who just said that.
Or Alan who just said that? Basically, yes, I was going to say something similar. The first one argues for the infringement on the rights of the individual, focusing on the economics. But it's more like the individual, like how the individual will suffer as a result. And the second one just talks about more like of an abstract theory of how the government is not allowed to, the separation of church and state, that somehow they're infringing upon the rights of the individual is an example of not separation of church and state, something like that.
I think that's exactly right. And Alan, does that kind of track, would you say that tracks what you were trying to describe in the in your chat? I think that was you, Alan, right? Let's see. Okay, let's see if we can unmute Alan. Okay, there we go. I tried. Press the button. Alan, hit me.
I don't know that it's the difference between the individual and the collective, which is sort of what I heard Miriam say, and I may have misunderstood. I was momentarily distracted. I thought what the first one said is it's a hardship to have to close your business on 2 days of the week. And it's a hardship for anybody who's not Jewish to have to either close their business on 1 day of the week or 2 days of the week, because that's an imposition. The second one clearly sort of argues from a religious grounds of you're making everybody observe the Sabbath as a Sunday.
Okay. And why is that a problem on the second one?
So the second one is a problem because it's establishing a norm of one religious tradition as a societally endorsed norm. So it's saying everybody, I think it's the same problem if you go to Israel, that if you want to buy a ham sandwich on a Saturday, you can't, because the Shabbos is Shabbos.
Right. So I will tell you, sometimes, there's this great article that was written right around the same time as this litigation, a couple of years after, in Tradition, the Tradition Journal, Tradition Magazine, I forget exactly what it's called. Somebody expressing, our minds go to Israel so quickly. I have a chat here, Chuck Weiss, mentioning the question of Israel, and Alan has, because, one of the things this article notes is how Jewish views regarding what Israel should be vary so differently, or may vary so differently from what we think America should be. In Israel, there's certainly a pull to having established religious norms impact the rules and regulations of the country. In America, there's this resistance. And this article goes on to talk a little bit about how confused non-Jews must be with these Jews. Like, for their country, they want this, but they want to deny that very thing to America. And how exactly does that all work? So there's certainly a tension here, and it's certainly worth thinking about. We're thinking about more broadly. How do our views on what America should be line up with what we think about Israel? Hold on, I want to give this Rabbi I want to give Joan her quick read over here. So Jones, here, let's see if I can pull up Jones. Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. You know, one of the concerns over here obviously is, and expressed by the second brief. Note who filed the second brief. It's a brief from the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, and the Anti-Defamation League, both of whom were kind of on the forefront of separation of church and state advocacy. Interestingly, the first brief that you read was the Synagogue Council of America. It used to be the umbrella organization for all the rabbinical organizations, for all the various denominations of Judaism, coming together in order to advocate, as was the national, the NACRAC, now the JCPA, National Community Relations Advisory Council. You know, each doing very different things, I think, in ways that track what Miriam and Alan said. I did see somebody was respectfully disagreeing with me in the chat, which is always awesome. I would suggest that Miriam seemed to overlay onto Israel. It's true. Clara, I certainly hear the point that, you know, as a result of our views here in America, we change to have these very different expectations of Israel. I would say that's certainly right, but let me just add to a point. You know, one saw this recently, can't help but comment, with all this litigation now and all the fights over, you know, especially in New York, over pandemic closings. You know, one of the things that there are articles out here in California, how in order to stay open as a school, you need to say that you're a camp. And in Tel Aviv, you had articles saying, in order to be open as a store, you needed to say you were a shul. The way in which, you know, your institutions are disguising themselves as the opposite in the two countries, given that there's a pull in each country for certain kinds of things, certainly I think, you know, American Jews still have this sense that, of course, houses of worship in Israel need to be open, even if we might have slightly different views in the United States. Now, you know, Clara, I don't, you know, different people are going to draw the lines in different places, but I think we're far more permissive, I would say, in terms of what we think about what is and isn't permissible in Israel than we are in the United States when it comes to separation of church and state. Let's leave that aside for a second. It's a fascinating question. The fact that it gets pulled in almost every time when you do Sunday closing laws, I think, is tells us something about the American Jewish psyche. You know, kind of where it goes, where our collective mind wanders. But let's think about this kind of idea that, you know, Miriam and Alan have both kind of put on the table, individual versus collective, or the kind of the economic consequences of Sunday closing laws versus kind of the church and state concern. Two very different kinds of concerns. You know, one of the things you might ask yourself under these circumstances is the following. Given their differences, what would each brief think the government has to do in order to solve the problem? Or put differently, what's the brief asking for? Take the first brief that's worried about this economic problem. What would government have to do to solve the problem? Anybody with a view on that? What would satisfy the authors of the brief? Stay open on Sunday, Miriam says. I think that's right. If your concern is, well, it's not fair, we have to be closed on 2 days, then the answer to that question is, oh, you should be allowed, religious institutions, Jewish institutions should be allowed to be open on Sunday. The problem isn't the law itself, right? The problem is as Alan said, the economic impact of being closed 2 days. The fact that Jews are being put to this choice of either your religion or your money. How do we solve the problem? Let everybody be open 6 days. How do we do that? Okay, if you got to be closed on Sunday, unless you have a different Sabbath. So just submit a form. Hello, I've got a different Sabbath. What day is that? Tuesday. Okay, good. You're closed on Tuesday. You're open all the other 6 days. Keep everybody on a level playing field with respect to finances, the economy, and simply say, everyone gets to be open 6 days. Your religious affiliation, your views on the Sabbath don't impact that. And nobody's being put to a choice of their religion or their money. The second brief, well, what would solve the problem for the second brief? Would that be enough? Randy's shaking her head no. Why not, Randy? Got to unmute you. I think I did.
The second brief that you'd have to get rid of the laws altogether about closing on any day, because you're violating atheist point of view. If they don't observe a Sabbath at all, they should be open every day of the week if that's what they choose.
Oh, interesting. Is it
just
only
the law in
atheists that are going to have a problem?
What?
Is it just atheists that are going to have the problem? Is this a problem because they're atheists?
Well, no, it's a problem just for anyone that doesn't want to be closed on the Sabbath for whatever reason. It's establishing a religion by saying that you have to close one day a week. It's still an establishment of religion. And that if you're going to say that the country should not establish a religion, then you shouldn't have a law regulating business that's based on a religious principle.
Okay. Okay, good. If you take a look, by the way, at the brief, at the first paragraph, oh, let me try and share it. Let me do that. You know, you see the aspirations of the second brief. They're much broader. Freedom of religious belief, observance, and worship. Both organizations are firmly convinced can remain inviolate only so long as there is no intrusion of religious authority in secular affairs or secular authority in religious affairs. Full stop. The organizations have always regarded the constitutional principle of separation of church and state as one of the foundations of our democracy and a bulwark of religious freedom. The idea is you can't have government getting involved at all. Solving my problem doesn't solve the problem. And that's because each brief ultimately has very different aspirations for America and the ability of Jews and other similarly situated people. The ability of Jews to have a place in the United States. To have a place for the first brief means that you do not make my ability to live my life, and included in that, the economics of my life, the finances of my life. You don't say to me, you're going to be put to a choice of living your life as a religious person, as a Jew, and your ability to support your family. I have to have the same opportunities that everybody else has. That's what it means for the Jew to have a place in the United States. The United States as an entity needs to afford me certain freedom of opportunity. And you can kind of hear that language, right? The idea that, you know, this is the land of opportunity and Jews should be on the same playing field. And to do something else is to undermine the place of Jews in the United States because of what the United States is. On the flip side, the brief of the AJC and ADL is very different. It says that the place of Jews and other similarly situated groups is undermined so long as such laws exist. Their inherent existence, the fact that they are part of the legal structure of the United States, in and of itself forecloses room for Jews. It's a problem. And what the United States needs to be such that Jews have a place in it is to not have such laws at all. Because ultimately what those laws do is that they elevate a certain form of living above others. They make certain kinds of people secondary. They even, in some manner, shape, or form, may lead, we'll talk about this more in the third case, lead to the manipulation of religion as it's pulled into the public square. And all of that, the very existence of these rules generate problems for Jews having a place in the United States. So if we started with kind of like a big question of, you know, what does this American project mean? What does the American Jewish project mean about figuring out who we are and what our place is in the United States, how religious liberty and our advocacy gives us a window into that process. We've started by noting we need to think about what kind of religious minority we are, and in turn, as a result, what kind of space needs to be created for us by the United States. And what do we want? Do we want a country that says to be free religiously means all people of all faiths will have equal opportunity? Or do we think no? We need a country that says religion will not be the motivating factor, will not trigger, generate the norms, the symbols, which kind of surround us as we live. Those are both different, very different sets of expectations for what we want the United States to be. And your choice about that tells you about how you want to advocate. And not just how you want to advocate, in very concrete ways. If the government showed up at your door and said, what do you want? It would change the answer to that question. I just want to get out of jail free. Or that law needs to go. Okay, good. I think I've missed a whole bunch of questions. Let me see what I can still pull up over here. Questions are moving fast. I can't read that quickly. Let me try with over here. Randy, it's Levanter. Anyone can close their business, whatever they want. Oh, I see I'm coming in the middle of a conversation. Okay, let me try this one. Yes, these laws might be imposed on other grounds. We limit the length of the work week for, okay. Agreed, no laws. Okay, I'm gonna have to pull out of this. Oh, this is a good one. Yeah, so Rabbi Sapowith has said something deeply true. She notes, we see the backlash to this. It says, quote, this Jewish minority is forcing our majority in founding faith indoors out of the public square. This was exactly what was going on in the 1960s. You know, the lawyer that filed these cases on behalf of Orthodox Jewish merchants tried to prevent all what he termed secular Jewish institutions from filing amicus briefs. He was concerned that there would be this perception that the Jews were coming for America's Christianity. And all he wanted was just to get out of jail free card. And so what you had was, not surprisingly, the two visions I described to you, I mean, they went at it. They litigated around each other, each one trying to convince the other or foreclose the other from intervening, because in many ways, these visions are somewhat incompatible. They demand very different things of government. They demand America to be very different kinds of things. This is 1961. Next case I'm going to show you, you know, we've ratcheted this up, like all other rhetoric, we've ratcheted this up, and the claims and the consequences have continued to grow. Maybe that's actually a good opportunity to move on to case number 3. We'll start it today. We'll move on Monday. Not Monday, I'm sorry. We'll move on Wednesday to kind of finish it up. But maybe today I'll put the story on the table and we'll kind of give our initial go at it. I see there are 2 hands. Alan, Betty, I hope it's okay if I move on. Please forgive me. Or those maybe hands that never got lowered. This is, yeah, okay. Alan gave me the thumbs up, and Betty, well, forgive me. Okay. That was awesome. Betty, I love that, throwing your hands in the air. That was perfect. That was amazing. I owe you one. Drinks later. So, okay, good. Let me try for case number 3. Case number 3, and we're going to fly back and forth through history, and hopefully you'll get a sense as to why I've ordered the cases in this way, about how the stakes keep on changing. We keep on pushing the boundary in ways that, you know, Amy kind of alluded to a minute ago, in terms of, you know, what will the non-Jews say? And in turn, kind of how that changes what our expectations of the United States are. So this is a case in 2017. Full disclosure before we start, I am the author of one of the 2 sources. If you want to play a fun game at home, you can try to guess which source did he author. Okay, fine. So here's the case, 2017. So you have the state of Missouri. State of Missouri, environmentally conscious. So they want to enact a law to help the environment. And here's how it works. They say to all nonprofits the following. They say to them, listen, here's what we're going to do. You can apply for grants, that if you're doing some sort of project and you need tires in order for the project, often for like to be ground up and used for paving. If you need something like that, we've got tons of recycled I'm sorry, we've got money. We know that there are places where you can get recycled tires. If you are willing to use recycled tires as opposed to new tires in your project, we'll provide you a grant. So far, so good. So you as a nonprofit, you got some project, just apply to us. Top, I don't know, 15 projects are going to get grants because they're using recycled tires as opposed to new tires. Fantastic. So there's this school, Trinity Lutheran Church and School. It's both a church and a school. They needed to pave their playground. So here's what they did. They applied for a grant. They said, we're going to make this great playground. You know what I'm talking about. You know the bouncy on the playground. It's great. And you know how it like gets pitted sometimes, right? And then kids start tripping and falling, you know, scrape knees, all the bad stuff. So they wanted to repave their playground. So they submitted a grant proposal. And what they got back from the state was the following. The state said, you came in fourth. I'm sorry, I don't remember, it was fourth or fifth of all the grant proposals we got. And we let a whole bunch through. I think maybe it was 14 that they let through. So you would have won, except you're a religious institution. So you automatically are denied funding. Why? Well, everyone agreed that Missouri could have extended the grant to a religious institution. However, at least under the First Amendment, they were allowed to. They chose not to because they had rules on the books, what we call sometimes mini Blaine amendments. I'll say something about why we call them that in a second, that said, under any circumstances, the state's money cannot go directly or indirectly to support religious institutions. So even if the federal constitution says, yeah, this is fine, the state constitution says, no, you're not allowed to do that. Absolutely not allowed to do that. No direct or indirect funding to religious institutions. Now, as it happens, Missouri's not the only state with one of these rules. I think by last count, 36 states had these sorts of rules on the books. And many of them go back to the 19th century at a time when the federal government actually tried to enact a rule like this. A constitutional rule, no money ever would go to religious institutions. And this was something thought up back in 1875 by a fellow named Blaine. And in his view, I think most people would say, it was motivated largely by anti-Catholic animus. The idea was that by and large in the United States at that time, public schools were pretty much controlled by Protestant sects of Christianity. And the goal was to keep Catholicism out. Catholicism was viewed in the 19th century, massive amounts of anti-Catholic animus. And so the idea was, James Blaine and others, let's keep it out. How are we going to keep it out? No money should ever go to religious institutions. How does that help? Well, if no money ever goes to religious institutions, they can only go to public schools. And, Protestants have control of the public schools. So then Catholic schools will never get money. Everybody with me, hopefully, on the idea over here? They never envisioned, of course, that it would be Protestants who started looking to the government for money. The irony is certainly not lost on Catholics that this case ended up being a Lutheran school, but let's leave that aside. History has a funny way of working itself out. Yes. Okay, good. So they had this book. Missouri had this rule in the book saying no money could ever go to directly or indirectly to religious schools. And so as a result, they could not give the money to Trinity Lutheran Church and School. Trinity Lutheran Church files suit. And they say, what you're doing violates the First Amendment. This is a form of religious discrimination. All other institutions that are similarly situated to us, nonprofits, you've opened up to private entities. You said all private entities that fulfill these criteria can get money. You've told us we would have satisfied all of this, just that we're religious. So you're excluding us based on our religious identity. And to do that is a form of religious discrimination. Everybody with me hopefully on the facts of the case? This goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Should we say, listen, free exercise of religion also prohibits religious discrimination, and you, Missouri, are excluding a religious institution from something that's available to all other private nonprofits? Or should we say, Missouri has made a commitment to the separation of church and state. It does not want its funding going to religious institutions because of all of the reasons implicated in the federal establishment clause. Okay, I get it. The establishment clause would allow the government to give money that's generally available to public entities, to also give it to a private entity if that money is not going for a religious purpose. The federal Constitution, at least in 2017, would allow that. Wouldn't have allowed it in 1970, but Supreme Court shifted a little bit. Okay, 2017 would allow it. We get that. But that doesn't mean the state of Missouri should be prohibited from taking a more stringent view on this subject, for trying to capture the values of anti-establishment, of saying we need separation of church and state. We need to further protect the citizens of our state, and prohibiting all funding directly or indirectly from going to religious institutions. Ruth said, could the city or state pave an amenity for a day school? Not sure what you mean. Not sure what you mean, Ruth. If you're asking kind of what the scope is of this prohibition, it wasn't completely clear what the scope of you can't do anything directly or indirectly for a religious institution. I think that's a fair question. It's something that came up actually in litigation in a variety of ways. You know, how far was the state willing to take this indirect concept? Nobody quite knows. Okay, good. Okay, so let's just start off. Maybe today we'll talk about who we think should win. And then maybe we'll move on to next time. What does Jewish advocacy look like on a question like this? What does that tell us about how we see ourselves and see America? So who's with the government on this one? Anybody with the government? Randy's with the government. Clara's with the government. Okay, anybody else? Feel free to tell me in the chat. Oh, I see Leonard is with the government. Dr. Vinnick. You know what, Dr. Vinnick, we haven't heard from you yet. Can I pull you in and ask you why? Is that legal? I'm going to unmute you. Hold on, Dr. Vinnick. I hope I did that. I think I did that. It didn't happen though. Tali, let me know if you have a way to unmute Dr. Vinnick. While we're doing that, I'm going to try to unmute. Oh, there we go. Dr. Vinnick, hit me. What do you got? Oh, you remuted yourself. This is amazing. We're gonna get there. One more time. There we go. Hit me. We're good. You're good.
I hit you? Well, I've been fascinated by the discussions and the comments of the audience that are partaking in this. And I always have had a dilemma in this country. I grew up in a small town where Sunday was closed and you had to donate to the Christmas decorations every year. And I had this argument with my father who went along with this. And I said, what the hell are you doing? You're Jewish. Protest this. Take it to the courts. No. And he made a very interesting statement. He said, you know, you live in a Christian society founded on Christian principles. He said, and you've been to Israel a number of times. What's the difference? And he hadn't. So I'm hearing all the arguments. I'm hearing all the discussions. But yet Israel has a problem. It's founded as a Jewish country. We don't live in a Jewish country, but we live in a country that has so many laws that are so debatable. I mean, the Hobby Lobby decision, the decision about not making a cake for a gay couple. I mean, it becomes almost ludicrous. But we have to keep in mind, I think, that we live in a Christian country, founded on Christian principles, founded that in the state of Massachusetts, Adams said you had to pay a tax for the church. That's why Rogers went and lived in Rhode Island. This is an ongoing historical fact. I don't know how these various laws and how the Jewish involvement can get involved when in a country that we founded in Israel, we say this is a Jewish country. I don't understand.
So Dr. Vinnick, who do you think should win then? Do you think the State of Missouri should win or the school should win?
I think the state of Missouri.
Okay. And they should be able to exclude the Christian school, even though this is a Christian country.
Yes.
Okay, got it, got it. Wayne, I saw your hand go up before. Wayne, what do you got for me? I hit unmute. Let's see if it worked. I'm gonna try Wayne. Let's
Okay,
see.
is this working now?
Yeah, good to
Okay.
hear you again.
So, I mean, I would also agree that, you know, with the government's position in this case, I just don't see, I mean, for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're building a playground. They're not involved in anything, a religious purpose. So why should a religious institution get a preference? And also, I'm saying that despite the fact that our synagogue here has just gotten a government grant for security installations. But, you know, it's just, it's taking money away from all of the non-religious. Like if this grant, let's say, is just going to schools, this means there's less money for public schools.
Oh, just to be clear, this was a grant only for private institutions.
Oh, okay.
The principle didn't impact public institutions. I would only add, of course, money is limited in the world, meaning,
True.
so it
doesn't, right, it does impact some people.
Yeah,
who are
that's right.
not going to be able to get the grant because a religious institution is getting it.
That's right. There's limited money in the world, as best I can tell. And so, ultimately what we would have is, if you give money to a religious group, it does impact in some way, other groups. Okay. I see it's 12:27. Let me try to wrap this piece up and tee us up for Wednesday. So on Wednesday, here's what we're going to think about. We're going to think about, a number of people, both in the chat and Wayne just mentioned now. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that increasingly Jewish institutions do seek various forms of funding, increasingly across denominations, I would say. Certainly, I would say a big shift was post-Charlottesville in terms of more and more Jewish denominations seeking funding for religious institutions from the government, notwithstanding historical views about the separation of church and state. And the question is, under these circumstances, it's one thing to say we shouldn't have laws motivated by religion, but are we willing to go a step further in terms of what we say, what we want from America? Are we willing to say what we should also get is we should be on equal footing with respect to funding as all other nonprofits? Or do we say, no, given what we think America needs to be and the way in which religion needs to be pulled out of the public square, we need to make sure even in these instances, states have the ability to withhold funding from religious institutions. And the arguments for and against, well, that's what we'll start teasing out when we start up again on Wednesday. Okay. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to email me or find me or something. We'll be starting up again Wednesday at same bad time, same bad channel, right, Tali? Okay, good. A pleasure. Those of you who took me up on engaging me, that's my personal favorite. Those of you hanging out with us, I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to continuing the conversation on Wednesday.